very few people are entrepreneurially minded, and that too in a high tech sense. And I'm not talking about if they had a lemonade stand when they were a kid or they washed cars or something. Because our educational institutions don't teach people to think like entrepreneurs. They teach people to be conformist, and the government wants conformists, but then you're actually snuffing out certain innate entrepreneurial spirits inside in one case.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast. I'm your co-host Vijay Mehrotra, and along with my co-host Michael Watson from Northwestern University, we are thrilled to welcome Kartik Gada to the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast. Kartik has a day job and a night job. In his daytime, he's a technology CFO and has been CFO at a number of cutting-edge companies, most recently within the AI space. And he's also got a passion and a commitment to exploring the concept of the increasing rate of change. He's published a book that's been downloaded tens of thousands of times and has a YouTube channel focused around the increasing rate of change. Today, we're going to tap into his famous clear-eyed perspective on how technology forces and the way in which change is being implemented is reshaping companies, economies, and the way that we work and the way we think about strategy. Karthik, welcome, and I'm going to throw it over to Mike to fire your first question at you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Karthik. So I guess let's just get started. Can you give us a brief overview of sort of what you mean by accelerating pace of change and sort of what impact it's going to have?
So what has been true since the beginning of life on Earth is that every process has been accelerating in nature. But only now are we getting more and more data to see how many places this shows up. Most people's first exposure to that is if they watched Carl Sagan's Cosmos in 1980. He had that cosmic calendar, and he said, well, all recorded history was only in the final 4 seconds of the year. And probably everyone remembers that, but then might have forgotten about it because it didn't show up anywhere else. Fast forwarding to about 1999, Ray Kurzweil has done a lot more research on that and bringing that to concepts of computer science like Moore's Law, but also to software and storage. And he did a lot to show why that appears in places other than Moore's Law and through all technological change, and how it's overarching in all processes, biological, informational, technological, and so forth. And then my major contribution, which I was surprised that was one of the first to do a lot of research on this and still one of the primary contributors on this whole subject, is on the economic side, in that economic growth, economic progress has also been accelerating due to the fact that technological progress is inseparable from economic change. And since technology continually moves faster and faster because the revolutionary outputs of the prior generation become the inputs of the next generation, economic progress also moves faster and faster, and not always in formal data that was established 70 years ago, but in other forms of measurement, such as the stock market, prices of many technological products trending towards zero, the poorest people in the world having technologies that even the wealthiest person of 60 years ago did not have, and the implications of that at scale and so forth. So I've done a lot of research and found a lot of data and correlations in that particular field. And so the accelerating rate of change in general is an important field that no one can afford to not be aware of in this day and age, in the 2020s, even though it was going on long before that. Now it's pervasive in everything. And on the economic side is where I've pretty much been the most prolific contributor over the last 20 years or so.
Well, I want to dig into that. So there's something I've been thinking about lately, and I could swear that I heard it from a mainline economist, but maybe it was in a conversation with you, and that is, as the cost of a technology goes down, the use cases that come in look quite different, right? I mean, this is sort of Jeffrey Moore stuff too. I guess I'd love to get your take on that, and then ask you a question that sort of follows from Mike's question, which is this moment different? And if so, what's different about it? The Gen AI moment that we're in.
So here's the thing. As costs of technologies go down, yes, they can be components of more and more business models, and certain people in the field of business, more so than economists who are very sort of old school in that way, but economists who are at least read by business audiences might mention that. But then they don't see it holistically because I quantify how this is a predictable percentage of the economy that's ever rising. For example, I run all these numbers, and right now, as we speak, it's about 4% of the world economy is what I would call high tech, meaning greater than 10% exponential improvement per year. 8 years ago was 2%, and 16 years ago was half of that, even 1%, and so forth. And back in the 1980s, it was a small fraction of 1%, too small to even notice. A few people knew about Moore's Law, but still was something that maybe 10,000 people actually knew about. So the thing is, all technological disruptions are not just interconnected, but they're a predictable pipe of a certain width in the economy. And even that widening of the pipe is predictable. Therefore, you can quantify the amount of disruption happening in the world at a given time, quantify the average total disruption in the world that will be happening in some near future date, 3 years from now, 5 years from now, and so forth. And also predict or assign a probability of what is ripe or overdue for disruption based on a status quo versus what's technologically possible. Gen AI is not a singularly unique moment in this trend, but it is an important chapter in the history of all technological progress because it's an inflection point that makes more people aware, just like the Netscape moment, August 9th, 1995. There was an internet before then, but the graphical user interface finally got a lot more people on it. It was usable to less sophisticated people, and therefore businesses formed. Gen AI and LLMs, which are just a current flavor of artificial intelligence, the trend lines of artificial intelligence are below that, are another point because, as we see, many processes that were lengthy or expensive even 3 years ago are now cheaper, and new businesses are being formed by that. We see AI companies with market caps of $1 billion with just 50 employees, for example. And this is not even newsworthy anymore because there's several of those now, and those numbers would have seemed extraordinary even just 4 years ago. So on one hand, it seems like an important inflection point, but if you see the trend in a logarithmic manner, this is right on schedule and just a continuation of the well-established trend. And it's exciting to be alive now because we're at a time where this will always be faster. It'll never be slower.
As a follow-up to that, since you've look at the economics, I've always kind of wondered this is, the high-tech sector is pretty obvious that that's going to continue to grow. But what about like bottlenecks in like the medical field or the education field? I've heard people talk about this, is that this will slow us down. There's bottlenecks in other large sectors of the economy. How do you see that progressing?
So here's the thing. There's a lot of institutional stickiness, even when the legacy institution is extremely inefficient. Disruption occurs around the edges. And unfortunately, this helps the smartest consumer first. Like, for example, in medicine, the two areas where technological disruption, both in AI and in other technologies, is the most total is in the general practitioner level. Because what does a GP doctor really do? They have about 50 different symptoms that they see and then ask a few questions. And it's really a very simple software program. If this, then this, if this, then this. And then they either order tests or a prescription, right? That can be automated completely. Sure, AI can make errors, but probably fewer than human doctors would make. The other area is psychology and psychiatry, where talking to an AI could be cheaper, more private, and much more accessible because the AI would draw from the knowledge of many psychologists and many psychiatrists. So over there, the disruption is total. Where disruption is much further away is in things like nurses, surgeons, things like that. That's still where someone has to use their hands, do something manual. There is not an imminent disruption in that. But then at the bureaucratic layer, as we all know very well, the U.S. healthcare system has too many perverse incentives that are hard to dislodge, in that keeping people sicker for longer is profitable and turning a cancer patient into a revenue stream is valuable. And we know that, big pharma likes to get more people on more drugs, and too many perverse incentives. And undoing that is hard until the disruption is so large at the global level that this finally topples. So it takes longer than people would expect, but then when it happens, it's quite violent. Same in education, violent in a economic sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Hopefully not real violence, although the CEO of United Healthcare was shot because of dissatisfaction with the system. In education, AI can be a personal tutor, and the best education is always from a tutor that customizes to the student's learning. And even better if you're at home and you're not spending time commuting to and from school, right? But the institutional rigidity and stickiness is quite high because everyone will say, well, you need a high school diploma or you need a bachelor's degree. Otherwise, you don't know something, even though everything in a bachelor's degree can be learned for free online. And the smartest students need college the least as a result. But there's still institutional rigidity that's only eroding around the edges. Some tech companies says they will not require a bachelor's degree, like Google, for example. And then if that becomes a cascade effect, fine. You don't have a bachelor's degree, but you have Google on your resume, we turn out okay. So the stickiness of the institutions makes things go on for longer. But then when the pressure is too great, it finally breaks. Because think of it this way. In some countries, the educational institutions aren't that good. So if they're using AI, they can leapfrog, for example, and have access to a better learning experience than any available in their country, for example.
That's interesting because I think your model is that although the change is happening behind the scenes and you don't actually see it until boom, that's sort of the dam burst, and then you see the whole thing all at once.
Yeah. And it can't be just a little bit better. It has to be 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times better. Then enough people say, you know what, we spend $20,000 per year per student on public schools in the US, and that's too much, and that's inefficient, and forget that. And the boss monster of all, if you will, is notice what was common among these two sectors. And the third one is construction, where similar things apply. All are heavily entangled into government. Therefore, their incentives are not productivity oriented. They're anti-productivity in a way. And government itself should be facing this disruption, but it's even stickier, of course, because when we say, well, AI could take away 40% of jobs in the private sector, then my first reaction, although I'm that type of person, is say, well, that means AI could do 70% of government jobs.
Right.
So why not automate 70% of government jobs, keep the best people, teach them to use AI. The cost could also go down 70%, taxes could be lower. And I thought Elon Musk was going to do something like that with Doge, but it turns out that's not what that was for. Right. But that was my hope, that was the vision there. Over time, that will happen because this AI is available to all countries in the world. And some country, whether it's Estonia or something like that, will say, we're automating bureaucrats and lowering taxes. That'll happen somewhere in the world. And then others will have to follow suit just to be competitive, because someone will have great services with no tax just because AI is doing what all of those government bureaucrats that you had to be on the phone on hold for an hour just to get to were doing.
So we've seen this and we've felt it as more and more waves of innovation come up. More and more of our jobs put people in a position where they've got information coming at them through all kinds of different channels and are out there trying to make the best decision they can. Do you have a sense of what that mismatch is like between how fast things are changing and how quickly humans are trying to adapt at the individual level? We've been talking about the institutional level, but I'd love to get your take on the individual level as well.
Here's the thing. There's about a 50-50 split between people who find rapid technological change exciting and exhilarating versus very unnerving and frightening. Generally a 50-50 split. One could make statements about old versus young or men versus women or whatever among that. But that is a pretty big bifurcation in what people feel about technology and how people are, in fact, becoming two camps. And if people are confident that they can use technology to their advantage, then obviously they're going to be more excited by it. But it's not always even that type of bifurcation. Some people just get excited about new progress. Whenever there's a new robot that can do a dance or something, and if you set it up in a street with just those little barriers on it, you'll get 5,000 people there in a very short time just to watch, for example, right? Then they won't say, well, maybe that robot could take away my job or something like that.
Right.
The other thing is we've trained too many people to think in terms of jobs as a binary thing, and that the function of, say, a head of state or government is to make sure you have a job or not have a job. I'll vote for this person if they will make sure I have a job. I will vote against this person if I have less confidence I have a job if they're in power. Unfortunately, that's how most voting is done ultimately in the middle of the bell curve. In reality, people have to be taught to think, well, if something is being automated, something that you're doing is being automated, there should be no emotional lag in ascertaining that, well, why don't I just employ all of this automation and be the employer of this automation and therefore compete with my boss potentially and pocket the difference, so to speak. Like if you were doing something that's 80% automated, then have five AIs or automations doing that work and you're the manager in the middle. Now, very few people think that way, even though they will have to be forced to think that way. And that is not anything new. It's just happening much faster than in the past.
Yeah, I did that myself 30 years ago, saying, hey, my boss is bringing me work and taking a huge chunk. I don't need that. I'll find my own work, right? That the opportunity to be entrepreneurial, I think, increases as the tools that are available to help you create get faster, wider spread, and cheaper.
Yes.
Something I've been wondering, like, what do individuals get wrong about the accelerating pace of change? Like, what do people miss at an individual level, or like, you're managing a group or managing?
Many people still think things are linear, and like I have a saying that whatever a person saw in the middle 40 years of their life, they think the whole world was like that before then and will be after then as well. That's a very common thing. Now, in the past, one could have the luxury of thinking that way, or even assuming that one's children would have the same lives as they did, and that's why societies had arranged marriage and all that, because, well, my life's going to be exactly the same as yours or whatever. So, of course, this makes sense. Whereas that's not true, because anyone who's a couple decades younger or a generation younger is growing up in a very different world. Physically, it may seem like the same world. You're breathing the same air and all that. But their entire perspectives, things they know about, all that are completely different. Someone who's very, very famous to 60-year-olds is someone that many 25-year-olds have simply never heard about, and you'd be surprised.
Yeah.
You haven't even heard about Al Pacino or someone, like they just don't know who that is, for example. And also judging, like parents trying to intervene in decisions their children make about what field to go into or who to get married to or what you must do in your life and all that is often wrong pressure in a way. So there's a lot of trouble there. And also people make wrong predictions, even all the way up to the government level. They say Social Security might be insolvent by 2070 or whatever. At the 2070, do you know how far off your prediction would be? That's like saying people from 1850 would still think the world would be like 1850 with no widespread electricity or airplanes, for example. Right? So all those assumptions, even at the top government level where trillions of dollars are at stake, are very linear, not in recognition of acceleration, often wrong. One of the reasons our national debt in the United States, being 120% of GDP, has not caused a crisis yet, whereas everyone thought that it would when it crosses 100%. That was the perception 2 decades ago. Is this accelerating rate of change is an extra cushion that is allowing more leeway. Now, unfortunately, they might test it to its real limit, but they don't realize how fortunate we already are that the danger zone was further away than we thought because of the accelerating rate of change.
So these 50% of people this is a different twist in the conversation. If we think about the people that embrace change, what's different about them? And how do we develop that capability, given that everything we've been talking about on this podcast?
It's a good question, because very few people are entrepreneurially minded, and that too in a high tech sense. And I'm not talking about if they had a lemonade stand when they were a kid or they washed cars or something. Because our educational institutions don't teach people to think like entrepreneurs. They teach people to be conformist, and the government wants conformists, but then you're actually snuffing out certain innate entrepreneurial spirits inside in one case. And even at the higher education level, for example, people study a certain thing, and it'll in the future be weird that people had to decide on a presumed entire life path quite early. Like if you want to be a lawyer, you do a pre-law sequence, then you go to law school. And the assumption is for the subsequent 40 years after you graduate from law school at 25, you'll be a lawyer, when we know this is not going to be the case for the next 40 years. The nature of the field will change so much. One could have made that assumption in 1970 for a career from 1970 to 2010, but not anymore. Same with the very, very lengthy and rigorous training of being a doctor if you're going to be a GP, when everything's on AI. So at the individual level, the institutional rigidity and the hierarchies that people are taught to strive into, like I have to do well in high school so I can go to a very good undergraduate school, so I can go to a good law school or medical school or whatever. And then after that, I can coast because it's a 40-year high-paying career. since that 4-year high-paying career will have a lot more variables in it than what used to be the case some decades in the past, this whole paradigm of education and who is preparing well for the future versus who is not is very different. I mean, I think we all know that whoever was the top student in high school is not necessarily the one who did the best many decades later. Sometimes that was the case, but many times it's not, because there were different skill sets being tested, right? So a lot of these assumptions that individuals have to be questioned, because making multi-year commitments on something that will be obsolete much sooner than was assumed after the fact, such as med school, law school, whatever, has to be revisited, or at least approached from an understanding that you'll always be employing AI, and what it is 10 years after graduation could be very different than what practicing doctors or lawyers might be doing in the field at this minute.
I think you have a great quote that I'd love you to expand on. I think it hits the same point about basically education in general. Your quote is, to help society the most, do what you do best. Can you expand on that and tell me, like, how do you turn that into practical advice for students?
People should, within reason, obviously taking out the worst extremes of that, if you do what you do best, the ability to earn a living from that is much higher, as well as the variety of adjacent type of things you could pursue. Now, it doesn't mean that anyone who's pretty good at singing should try to be a singer necessarily, but within reason, like there was a tremendous oppression in the past that to have a well-paying career, you had to pursue just one out of 3 or 4 things, right? Yeah. Medicine, law, and then a couple of other things, MBAs or academia or something like that. And if you weren't good at these 3 or 4 things, as determined by how well you do in an academic environment, you're kind of relegated to something of lower status. And all this is decided very early in a person's life too, which is also not right. Whereas if you're good at a lot of different things and you can envision creating a business or a practice out of that, or even making it adjacent to your broader field, for example. I mean, what I do is I'm a CFO, but I have a social media presence and I'm a thinker on these economic topics. And that has helped my normal career as well, just because more people know about me, right? Or they approach me with opportunities. And thinking about that holistically and using AI to perhaps do the tedious work to destroy the barriers to entry can allow someone to turn what might have just been a hobby into a side hustle, or what might have been a side hustle into a primary hustle, or some combination thereof. So the ease at which one can do that is dropping exponentially. So people should be more ambitious about thinking that this can be pursued intelligently. Now, it's not the same thing as like a teenager who assumes they can be a pro athlete when there's a 1 in 10,000 chance, or someone who thinks they can be a successful actor, actress when there's 1 in 2,000 chance. Not at that extreme, but still there's more leeway other than rigid silos of mainstream career progression that are assumed.
Yeah. The other way I like to think about this too is that maybe I'm not right in this, but I always encourage people to work on their strengths. Like you'll get much better at working on the things you're strong at than you will improving the things you're weak on. Like, what's your thoughts on that?
That's true to some degree. I mean, if the weakness is a low-hanging fruit, and I think of it as a mathematical equation in a way, it's not addition, it's multiplication. If anything is 0, then everything is 0, right?
Okay, yeah.
But that being said, I tell people, like, average people who are not particularly wealthy, no need for you to donate to charity, because billionaires would donate to the charity if they believed in it, because what they're best at is making money. Maybe what you're best at is something else. Maybe you're better at being a mentor. Someone could benefit more by having you as a mentor than having Elon Musk or Bill Gates as a mentor, because they wouldn't understand how that person is talking. So the most successful mentor is not the best mentor that way, right? So those are ways to think about do what you do best. Like if you want to do some good, unless you're very wealthy, donating to charity isn't moving the needle, and think about some way to harness what you do best for a cause you believe in, and you'll have a much higher impact than the people who donate $100 or something.
So back on kind of rates of change, I want to talk about complexity a little bit, because there's all of this talk around analytics and data science and data and AI optimization helping you manage your way through complexity and helping you deal with a more complex world. But don't they also add complexity? And how do you think about that tension?
It adds a lot of complexity, and AI becomes mandatory aspect of managing that complexity, because all of us are already doing something. Like if there's a super long research paper or article, you may just go to your favorite LLM, Grok, Gemini, ChatGPT, whatever, and say, create summary bullet points because you don't have time to read the whole thing. And that is the removal of the complexity into a manner you can consume. So while the complexity keeps rising, AI is a tool to navigate that. And even that becomes a separator between who is getting more and more done versus who is getting bogged down in the complexity. Now, the other type of complexity, which is a positive, is that when there's greater and greater economic complexity, there's a more robust economy and greater opportunity for specialization. And that's why recessions would both either go away or become far milder, despite the media scaring everyone about recessions, because there's so much activity outside of what would have been considered a traditional business cycle 30, 40 years ago, that it becomes more academic in nature, right? I mean, even stock market corrections are briefer and rebound faster than before because of this rising economic complexity, which is a more a greater diffusion of redundancy, and this isn't a real word, but I use it, and robustification in the system. And if it's not a real word, it should be, but yeah.
I like it.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting what you're saying in a way is that without the technology that helped create the complexity, we can't manage it and we can't engage with it.
The same technology that creates the complexity helps manage it and enables the savvy human to harness that complexity for their benefit. Think of it this way. If you go back 200 plus years, there are only 4 professions that a man could do and maybe 2 that a woman can do, and that's it. And if you weren't good at those 4, you were nobody, right? And people like us would not have done well at that time in those days. So we're fortunate to be here now. But so that was too little complexity. Even in many modern economies, you see certain funny situations like Australia, a country where my sister lives. It's a funny country in that it's an advanced Western economy, but so much of what they did was just commodity exporting and tourism and all that. So their knowledge sector is surprisingly primitive for a English-speaking Western country, So they have too little economic complexity, and their best and brightest tend to leave. My sisters, in-laws and all that, they work at top firms in the U.S., but they left Australia, even if on the surface, Australia and the U.S.'s prosperity is similar, just because of wanting to be specialized, like being a professor at a top institution or being a partner at a top consulting firm in a pharmaceutical field, or things like that. It's harder just to do that in Australia. So the complexity is in the economy is necessary for harnessment of top talent and to remain competitive. Like, for example, China is succeeding because they embraced economic complexity, even if it's not a democracy, it's a one-party state and all that. They embraced economic complexity head on and have every sector now, and they're very advanced now.
So, Karthik, what does this say, this increasing rate of change, what is the smart leader to do? What is the leadership response to carry your organization, your institution forward in a world where everything is changing? Not only your own capabilities, but your markets, your customers, their care-abouts, their worry-abouts. What does good leadership look like in this world?
So one would be to fight the default institutional rigidity. Once a corporation becomes big, the incentives tend to get around maintaining the status quo. And part of that's also human nature, because even big tech companies become that way because all the upper executives are their best risk reward situation is to maintain the status quo. And that's why when everyone questions a startup saying, well, why didn't the big company do that? It says, well, the big company doesn't have the incentive to take risks like this, because otherwise there would still be only one US tech company, which is IBM. And none of these other ones would ever emerge at all, because everything would have still been invented by IBM. So reducing this institutional rigidity is important. Understanding downturns are not like our father's downturn, so to speak. Like when there's a recession, what used to happen is they would lay off a bunch of people when it's already too late, and then a year later they would hire them back when there's certain businesses improving, but they're behind the curve on both instances. Whereas now getting that wrong is costlier, because if you're in an information heavy type business, or even a business that produces a hard end product but very knowledge heavy, one should tough it out through recessions rather than overcutting, because the rebound will happen sooner and your competitor can hire the people you laid off faster, and then you'll never recover. And we've seen that happen even with certain tech companies. Like when I was graduating from business school, I worked at Intel, and that was either the highest or second highest market cap tech company of all. And Andy Grove was Times Man of the Year. And now it's not even the top 2 semiconductor companies, let alone tech companies, right? So, which is, I mean, and no young person aspires to work at Intel. I don't know anyone.
Not at all. I mean,
there. Yeah.
Whereas that was the hot place
in the 90s. If you got to Intel, you were awesome. At that time, that's what that was. And that was because despite everything they knew, despite Moore's law originating from them and everything else, they did not understand some of their own situation. And you would think, why should NVIDIA even exist? Why should AMD have surpassed Intel? They should have gotten that right. So institutional rigidity has to go down. And they made mistakes 20 years ago. To make mistakes now would be even more costly, faster. And thus executive incentives have to be less ossified and fight this default of the status quo. And all this sounds, nobody disagrees with this when I say this outright, but this is the human nature. If an executive is in a cushy job and maintaining the status quo becomes easy, it's not official policy top down. It just becomes the default unspoken assumption at a big company.
Right.
Yeah. Look, it's funny. The kids today, they don't understand a world where Intel was a phenomenal place to work and Apple was nearly out of business. But it wasn't that long ago.
And NVIDIA, Google, and other companies considered big, mature companies didn't even exist by that point. Now it's like 3 generations subsequent to that.
Right. So, Karthik, it seems like we could talk for like 3 hours and you'd have great insights for us. Where can listeners learn more about some of your thinking, your ideas, hear you talk, et cetera? Like, where would you point listeners to?
So I published a book that I've retitled as Third Millennium Economics, but it used to be called The Atom, and it was featured in a Google Talk 9 years ago, but it's available for free online as a website. 400,000 people have looked at it. I also do a YouTube channel around this and associated themes. It's under my name, Kartik Gada. And I'll have a chapter in Vijay's book coming out, so you can see the latest thinking there. But I do keep up on YouTube and such regarding new thought and new discoveries about this accelerating rate of change. Like, why do I think that it's now 4% of the economy that's high tech, and in 8 years it'll be 8%? So what we think is fast now, it'll be much faster even then, for example. Or new methods of measurement of economic progress, like the percentage of a person's income that is spent on energy has continuously been going down. This is not what people think is true. They think the electricity bill is very high, but it's actually going down. And that data goes back over a century. And that is a very, very robust and indisputable sense of a measurement of economic progress, just because it transcends all currency, inflation, whatever you think about that can be removed by looking at energy consumption. And if you like topics like that, then my publications and my YouTube output is a place where one can find more.
Excellent. Well, I really appreciate you putting a plug in for the book as well. So thanks everybody for joining us on the Decision Intelligence Lab podcast again this time. Huge thanks to Karthik as our guest, and huge thanks to Mike as my co-host. If you like us, please like and share this with your friends. If you don't like us, then like and share it with your enemies. We really appreciate you joining us.